Conservatives letting big polluters off the hook and sticking taxpayers with the bill to clean up the environment.
Of course, the polluter pay principle is at the heart of this government's environmental philosophy. We favor a policy of responsible resource development.
Stark warnings from Canada's Environment Commissioner today sparked very pointed questions in the House. In his final report to Parliament, Scott Vaughan says Canada is not at all prepared to handle a major oil spill. Taxpayers could end up paying a hefty price for a major cleanup. He warned that oil and gas development is outpacing environmental protection, among other warnings. What are the dangers to the environment? What does it mean to your health and maybe to the economy? And what more could the government do? Let's get some insight from the man who wrote the report, Environment Commissioner himself, Scott Vaughan. Good to see you. There are a lot of warning bells in here. Out of all the things you talked about not understanding the chemicals used in fracking. You talked about liability issues. You talked about environmental regs outpacing the speed, or not being outpaced by the speed of development. What concerns you most? What's most urgent?
Well, Evan, there's unfortunately it's a long list of urgent issues, and I mean one of them is liability limits, for example. So that is, how much are companies on the hook on absolute liability limits. In Canada, for the offshore oil and gas liability limit on the Atlantic, $30 million. You compare that to the United Kingdom, $250 million. In Norway, no limits. I mean, the companies
30 million.
30 million. So, but Evan, I think the more caution, the bigger cautionary tale from that is, $30 million in the absolute limit. The cost now of Deepwater Horizon cleanup in the Gulf of Mexico is running to $40 billion. So, and similarly on nuclear installations, we said, what's the liability limit Canada has? $75 million. That $75 million sounds like a lot. U.S. $12 billion. Netherlands $3 billion. Japan 1.5. And the last time that was looked at was over 35 years ago almost. So,
Commissioner Vaughan, so the idea that polluters pay, I mean, that smacks like a joke. If $30 million is the liability, then the taxpayers are on the hook for something that could run in the billions of dollars. Is that right?
Well, so just to be clear,
not paying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what happens, there's the absolute liability, which is sort of like a no-fault insurance. So, right. Regardless of fault, and then anything else requires then a civil suit or court action. And Canadian courts are quite different from U.S. And so this could drag on. Exxon Valdez dragged on now for over 20 years. So, tying this up in court. So the real risk, Evan, is exactly that is, potentially taxpayers can pay. And just, one point, last year we said, contaminated sites in this country from not doing enough environmental oversight, 22,000 sites is going to cost us and our children over $8.3 billion in environmental liabilities just from those contaminated sites.
You talked about that $8.3 billion liability for contaminated sites. You were on this program talking about that. In this report, you talk about fracking for shale, which is a new way of extraction. Things like the Sydney tar ponds were part of those contaminated sites that you talked about. Do you have a concern that what we don't know about new technology being widely used and frankly widely hailed by industry like fracking could be the next Sydney tar ponds?
Well, I mean, I think, Evan, what is important is, the simple questions we asked are, what are the chemicals going into these? And, you say new, but there's 200,000 hydraulic fracturing sites across Canada, and the volume is going to increase in the next 20 years. So, this industry has just exploded in the last 5 or 6 years. And we've asked a simple question. What are the chemicals going in, and what are those risks those chemicals pose? And the answer we got is right now the federal government really doesn't have a handle on either. So, unable to answer those two questions. And then the risk then is exactly that, is it's not just the chemicals going in. Each site, over 11 million liters of water, and of that up to 200,000 liters of chemicals going in. Some of them has already been designated toxic in other applications, But then the other thing is what comes out with the fracking. In Nova Scotia, there's 2 tailing ponds that have been sitting there now for 7 years, and in addition to all the chemicals that came out, it pulled out radioactive isotopes, which were 6, 7, 10 kilometers below. So that then is similar to the contaminated sites.
So this
issue.
Could be a future contaminated site. It's already liability over $8 billion. What did you find when it comes to regulators, departments trying to deal with the changes in those omnibus budget bills to things like Environmental Assessment Act, Fisheries, Navigable Waters Protection Act? What did you find around that?
Well, surprisingly, we found a sort of a high degree of uncertainty and bordering on confusion. So fish habitat policy introduced last year, dramatic changes in the way federal oversight of that. We went in and then asked the fisheries departments of fisheries and oceans, so what's the implications? And they said, we do not know moving forward. And similarly, for the changes in the Federal Environmental Assessment Act, the two offshore boards in Newfoundland and Labrador said they weren't forewarned. They look at environmental assessments every day. They've decided for now it's better to just stick with the old law. And so they're going to go and continue doing everything that they were required to do over the old law. They're not required, for example, I'll give you one example, they're not required now to look at exploratory drilling. And exploratory drilling was what Deepwater Horizon was about.
So measure that against reassurances from the government that these changes to Navigable Waters Protection Act, the Fisheries Act, they say they're increasing their environmental stewardship based around development. You're saying your findings wouldn't jibe with that.
Evan, what I would say is, we found a lot of, fairly significant problems today in areas, not only what we just talked about, mines north of 60. Federal government has a responsibility to inspect those. 70% of those required inspections are not being done in those mines. So nobody wants another giant mine with almost, $800 million in liabilities. So, I think it's critically important that, the government gets this right. We've made recommendations, and one thing I would say is the recommendations on the offshore regime. We've set a number of significant problems. We've made the recommendations, and I've been impressed by just how serious the system is now to say, acknowledge, yes, we've got a problem, and go and close those gaps that we've identified.
All right, there is an acknowledgement, but the question is on action.
Yeah.
Now, one of the ideas now, a lot of controversy around pipeline development, Keystone XL, Northern Gateway, and of course now West-East. I was just here, and I think you watched the interview with Premier Alward and Premier Redford from Alberta and New Brunswick. They're proposing this.
Yeah.
I asked Premier Redford of Alberta what she thought of your report. Here's one of the things she said.
Throwing out suggestions that governments aren't going to be responsible with respect to shale gas development isn't fair when you have governments right across the country, including Alberta, that are coming to terms with what that regulatory process looks like right now. Because we do know that economic development has an environmental impact, and we want to make sure that we're not only regulating it, but that we are monitoring it.
That's one thing she said. I want your response to that. The other thing she said is, look, Alberta and the federal government have this great monitoring system, she said, and I asked her about it. That is a world-class monitoring system. John Baird first announced it. And that is a sign of the environmental stewardship. What's your take on what she said?
Well, firstly, I absolutely agree with the Premier that you cannot proceed with resource development unless you ensure that the environmental systems are in place to protect human health and environmental quality. And, right now, the cautionary tale we've said today, there's a boom in natural resource development. You need a boom in environmental protection to make sure that we're not facing new legacies, 10 or 20 years from now. On the second issue of the world-class plan, that was over 2 years ago, the government has announced it. I understand to date, there is no plan on the table. There's negotiations between Alberta, between Edmonton and Ottawa. But, the last time we spoke to officials from Environment Canada, they've said they're still working on the agreement for the funding mechanism, the agreement for the governance mechanism. Environment Canada is doing a lot of work on their own in monitoring. But if you remember, the Dowdeswell report from 2010 said, a lot of people are doing stuff. You need to get everybody on the same page and get an integrated monitoring plan with both levels of government. And right now, that is still not.
So when you hear saying check the website, we've got. Is it anything? Let's try to talk in language people can understand. Is it anything more than a website and a slogan, or is there substance to this monitoring? Yet, 2 years later, is there anything there that Canadians can actually get real data, real substance, or so far is it talk, no action?
Well, they're doing, there's stuff on the ground, but if you remember what the Dowdeswell report said is, there's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff, but what you needed to do was to make sure that the data systems were coordinated, that people knew what they were doing together with the both levels of government. And to date, as of today, there's still not an agreement between the provincial and the federal government. So I have no doubt the province is doing a lot, the Environment Canada is doing a lot. Do they have an integrated plan? The answer right now is no.
Right now, no. Your last day on the job, March 31st, you take over the President and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. How much of an impact do you believe your office has had on the government's direction?
Evan, I'm actually really proud. I've been in this job now 5 years. I'm more confident today in leaving this job than I did when I started that our office does have an impact. Canadians trust the Office of the Auditor General because we're impartial, we're objective, we make recommendations. I think we've made a difference on a whole number of issues. There's still obviously a lot of work to do.
All right, you are part of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. This is your new report right here. Actually, that's just one section of it. There's a lot of it. You can get it on the website.
It is on the website, yep.
We urge people to read it. It's all you read this, you can ask better questions. The Environment Commissioner Scott Vaughan, ending 5 years, March 31st. Good to have you here with your last report.
Great, thanks, Evan.